Deuteronomy 5, starting with verse 6. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the place of slavery. Do not have other gods besides me. Do not make an idol for yourself in the shape of anything in the heavens above or on the earth below or in the waters under the earth. You must not bow down to them or worship them, because I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the father's sin to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing faithful love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commands. Do not misuse the name of the Lord your God, because the Lord will not leave anyone unpunished who misuses his name. Be careful to remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy as the Lord your God has commanded you. You are to labor 6 days and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You must not do any work, you, your son or daughter, your male or female slave, your ox or donkey, any of your livestock, or the foreigner who lives within your gates, so that your male and female slaves may rest as you do. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out of there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. That is why the Lord your God has commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Verse 16. Honor your father and mother as the Lord your God has commanded you, so that you may live long and so that you may prosper in the land the Lord your God is giving you. Verse 17. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not give dishonest testimony against your neighbor. Do not covet your neighbor's wife or desire your neighbor's house, his field, his male or female slave, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. May the Lord bless the reading of his word. That was the Ten Commandments, the second time it appears in the Scripture. One of the most significant dates in recent history takes place on November 24th, 1859. Does anybody happen to know, this is a long shot, but does anybody happen to know what happened on November 24th, 1859? It's okay, I didn't know either. I looked it up. It was an event that sent ripples throughout Western civilization and finally the entire world. It literally changed the planet. It wasn't a war or the acts of a warlord. It wasn't a great technological invention, as you might suppose. In fact, it was nothing more than an idea. It was the date a certain book was published. It was a book that changed the world. On November 24th, 1859, Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species was published. And if his ideas and the ideas of those who followed after him and built upon him were true, then the implications were far-reaching. It meant, if his ideas were true, that the earth was not created but formed by unknown natural processes. If his ideas were true, life was not created but evolved through complex chemical processes. If his ideas were true, by default, there were many parts of the biblical text that were no longer true or that were found to be false. If his ideas were true, natural selection then would allow only strong, healthy creatures to continue their genetic lines. And so it came down to two possibilities. That because of the ripples of Darwin's ideas, there is, according to those ideas, no objective standards of morality. What is true, what is moral, what is good, or what is evil is dictated by one thing alone: culture. And in our culture particularly, what is moral comes from what you think is moral. You get to choose your own morality. It's kind of like a buffet. Well, you like the fish, well, I like the chicken. And so you have your ideas, I have mine. And don't put your ideas upon me, because morality is nothing but a buffet from which we all can make our own choices. And so that is one possibility. The other possibility is that God is the only true and objective source of morality in the universe. That whatever he says is evil is in fact evil. And whatever he says is good is in fact good. Our opinions are absolutely irrelevant according to the Scripture if God does sit on his throne. And so this is the choice that our culture really has to make today. It reminds me of a movie that came out several years ago called A Time to Kill. I don't know if you ever saw this movie, but basically it was about a young African-American girl, I think 10 years old, and the movie was about revenge and about race relations, but there were a couple of just scumbag white guys that kidnapped this little African-American girl, and they raped her, they tortured her, and abused her, and then killed her. So the girls, for some reason in the court, the two guys who committed the crime, there was a technicality, and they were let go. And so you can imagine how the father felt. Well, the father was played by Samuel L. Jackson, and so he did what I guess many fathers would do. He grabbed a firearm and took matters into his own hand and gunned down the two guys that had raped, tortured, and killed his daughter. And so the movie was about the court case of the district attorney prosecuting Samuel L. Jackson for an act of revenge. Well, at the end of the movie, in possibly one of the dumbest lines I have ever heard in any movie, and that's saying something because a lot of dumb lines come out of Hollywood, Matthew McConaughey, who is the lawyer defending Samuel L. Jackson, he's talking to the courtroom. It's the end of the movie. All of the tension has been building and building and building, and he says this to the jury concerning Samuel L. Jackson's crime. He says to them, "So until that day, we have a duty under God to seek the truth." Now this sounds good. We have a duty to seek the truth. But here's where he goes wrong. We have a duty under God to seek the truth, not with our minds, where fear and hate turn commonality into prejudice, but with our hearts. Truth and justice and right and wrong comes down simply to a matter of the heart. If it feels wrong, it's wrong. If it feels right, it's right. And that is what our culture has been reduced to. That morality is based upon the culture, the circumstances, and the ebb and flow of popular thought. Well, the Scripture gives us a different idea about the universe. It says that however long ago it took, that there was a God on a throne who spoke the world into his existence, the universe into existence, and because he is the creator, he gets to set boundaries. He gets to create rules and regulations. How dare God do that? Who does he think he is? Well, he thinks he's God. And because he's made everything, he gets to determine what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is evil, and it is independent of our opinion or our culture or our politicians or our famous actors or any other personality. And so we have been studying the Ten Commandments, and we have 2 weeks of introduction, and in the introduction I've titled this 10 Things You Might Not Know About the Ten Commandments. So let's just review what we went over last week. The first thing that we looked at was that the Ten Commandments began with the Abrahamic covenant. In other words, God came to Abraham and said, "I am going to make you into a great nation." Well, the idea that a nation is going to begin necessitates the creation of government and rules and regulations. And so that's really where it started. We also learned that Abraham and his offspring ended up in Egypt. They became slaves, and for 400 years, the children of Israel were slaves in Egypt. And then, of course, God called Moses, and through the power of the Lord, he called all those people out of Egypt. They crossed the Red Sea, down the Sinai Peninsula, and here is this group of 2 million people, ragtag slaves, some of one race, some of another race, different races, different cultures, different beliefs, this ragtag, motley crew hanging out, and the Lord said, I'm turning this into my nation. And so they gathered together at the foot of Mount Sinai. And we found out that the 10 Commandments were first spoken. That all the people gathered around, that fire came down from heaven, the earth shook, trumpets blared, all of this kind of crazy stuff going on. And out of the storm, a voice appeared. And the 10 Commandments were uttered by no one other than the Lord himself. And then afterwards, Moses wrote them down. Then later on, Moses went back up the mountain. He was up there for probably a month or two. And when he came back down, the people thought he had been killed, so they set for themselves up a golden calf and began to worship it. And Moses was so mad, he took the 10 Commandments and he smashed them on the ground. And so he went back up the mountain, and we find that it was both God and Moses who rewrote the 10 Commandments on the tablets. We also discovered that the 10 Commandments were given to a nation, not to an individual. That it is impossible for any one person to obey all of the laws because it was set up as a government. It was not just a list of rules for personal morality, but it was the creation of an actual governmental structure. And so no person today could actually go and obey those laws. It necessitates an entire system at work. We've also found that the 10 Commandments were part of a bigger covenant, that God made a covenant with his people in Exodus 24. There were 613 laws, 613, some positive, some negative, and the 10 Commandments were a part of that entire picture. And finally, number 6, was the 10 Commandments were not the top 10 most important things, because some have said, well, wait a minute. Why don't they have rape or child abuse or something on the list? Well, these aren't the 10 most important. These were the commandments that would most set apart the Israelites as being holy among the other nations. So these are the 6 things that we've looked at so far. If you have your bulletin on the inside, you can follow along. There's notes. If you're one of the types that likes to fill in the blanks, you can fill in the blanks. You can make a paper airplane, but I ask that you save that for after the service, not during the service, because that happened once and it wasn't good. Anyway, so we're following along in our notes. Let's look at number 7. The 7th thing you might not know about the 10 Commandments. Here it is. The 10 Commandments rested in the Ark of the Covenant inside the tabernacle. The 10 Commandments rested inside the Ark. The 10 Commandments were brought back down from the mountain, and the Lord gave Moses and the community very specific instructions on what to build. And so they created these tabernacles, what we would just call a tent, and there was religious furniture, so to speak. There were different altars, and there were different candles, and there were different setups, and then he finally told them you need to make an ark. And so they built this ark. Exodus 24, verse 16, he said, put the tablets of the testimony that I will give you into the ark. Well, what do we know about this ark? Well, we know that it was 45 inches long and 27 inches wide and high. We know that it was made with acacia wood and overlaid with gold, and that the top of it was pure gold called the mercy seat, and that there were 2 cherubims on the top facing each other. You might say, well, Nathan, this looks kind of Egyptian. Well, I think that's probably what it looked like, because all the people who built this thing were living in Egypt and were influenced by Egyptian culture and art. And in fact, a slave culture usually doesn't have a higher culture. So my guess is that it would have looked somewhat Egyptian-ish, if I can use such a phrase. And we found that the Lord even gave his Holy Spirit upon some people to build it because they didn't have the craftsmanship to be able to do it. Some will ask, well, what was the purpose of this ark? Well, let's read a couple of verses. This is from Numbers 10. But Moses said, please do not leave us. He's speaking to God. You know where we should camp in the desert, and you can be our eyes. If you come with us, we will share with you whatever good things the Lord has given us. So they set out from the mountain of the Lord and traveled for 3 days. And the ark of the covenant of the Lord went before them during those 3 days to find them a place to rest. The cloud of the Lord was over them by day when they set out for the camp. Whenever the ark set out, Moses said, "Rise up, O Lord, may your enemies be scattered, may your foes flee before you." And whenever it came to rest, he said, "Return, O Lord, to the countless thousands of Israel." And so they would send out the ark in front of them when they traveled, and there was actually rules that you had to stay a certain distance from the ark as it went ahead of them. In Psalm 32, it says, "Let us go to his dwelling place. Let us worship at his footstool. Arise, O Lord, and come to your resting place, you and the ark of your might." And one last passage from Joshua. "When you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, and the priests who are Levites carrying it, you are to move out from your positions and follow it. Then you will know which way to go, since you have never been this way before. But keep a distance of about 1,000 yards between you and the ark. Do not go near it." The bottom line was that this ark was a symbol of God's power and his presence. Now, I know what you're thinking, but wait a minute. I saw Raiders of the Lost Ark. And there's an interesting scene in that movie. Dr. Jones is at whatever college which he's serving, and he has another scholar friend with him, and there's somebody from the equivalent of the FBI. And they're trying to find information about the Ark of the Covenant. And so Dr. Jones opens up this ancient manuscript that has pictures in it conveniently. And in the picture, you have a couple of priests holding up this ark, and all of this lightning is coming out of the ark, and people are dying and shielding their faces from it. And the FBI agent says, "Good Lord," when he sees the photo. And Dr. Jones says, "Yes, that's what the Hebrews thought." And then the other scholar says, "What's that supposed to be coming from the ark?" And Dr. Jones says, "Well, who knows? Lightning, fire, the power of God." And then the FBI agent says, "I'm beginning to understand Hitler's interest in the thing." Because in the story, Hitler was digging all over the world trying to find this Ark of the Covenant. And then here's what Dr. Jones says. "Oh yes, the Bible tells of it leveling mountains and wasting entire regions. And Moses promised that when the ark was with you, your enemies will be scattered and your foes will fall before you." And in the movie, there was a pregnant pause. And Dr. Jones says, "An army which carries the ark before it is invincible." Now, all of that is total fiction. There's no instance in the Bible of the ark leveling mountains and wasting entire regions, and there's no such thing about any army who carries the ark is invincible. And in fact, when the Philistines stole the ark, they broke out in tumors, and so it wasn't a good thing. So the ark was not a talisman. It was not a magic item from which people could gain victory. In fact, look what it says in Jeremiah. "Return, faithless people, declares the Lord, for I am your husband. I will choose you, one from a town and two from a clan, to bring you to Zion. And then I will give you shepherds after my own heart, who will lead you with knowledge and understanding. In those days, when your numbers have increased greatly in the land, declares the Lord, men will no longer say, 'The ark of the covenant of the Lord.' It will never enter their minds or be remembered. It will not be missed, nor will another one be made." In other words, people were saying, if we could just get the ark back, we could win. And God's saying, no, it wasn't the ark, it was me. The ark was just a symbol. And so here's number 8. The 10 Commandments disappeared from history along with the Ark of the Covenant. So people will say, well, where are the 10 Commandments? Well, they were placed in the Ark, and so wherever the Ark is, there also rests the 10 Commandments. Now, we know there was a lot of adventure with this ark. They built it in the desert. When they were, speaking of mobile churches, they were a mobile group. They just had tents, and they would set up and move all around the desert until one day they said, Lord, we need a king. You don't want a king? No, we want a king. Everyone else has a king. You don't want a king? Yes, we want a king. Okay, I'll give you a king. And so they gave the nation a king, and they moved the capital, I think it was in Hebron, and then they moved it to Jerusalem under David, and that is when David's son Solomon built the temple, a physical temple, so they no longer resided in tents, but in that temple and in the depths of those tents, they placed this Ark of the Covenant, and the tablets were inside it along with some other objects. So 1 Kings chapter 8 says this: when the elders of Israel had arrived, the priests took up the ark. They brought up the ark of the Lord and the tent of meeting and all the sacred furnishings in it. The priests and Levites carried them up, and King Solomon and the entire assembly of Israel had gathered about him were before the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and cattle that they could not be recorded or counted. And so they actually brought the ark finally up into this new temple, and there it sat. Well, where is it today? Where is this ark? Can we find it in a government warehouse in a box? Are archaeologists going to dig this thing up? Well, there's a couple of theories. I think the first one holds the most weight. The first theory is that a pharaoh by the name of Pharaoh Shishak took it. 1 Kings chapter 14, in the 5th year of King Rehoboam, this is Solomon's son, Shishak, king of Egypt, attacked Jerusalem. He carried off the treasures of the temple of the Lord and the treasures of the royal palace. He took everything, including all the gold shields Solomon had made. This, for me, kind of settles it. It was placed in the temple, and probably 20 years later, the temple gets plundered by this Egyptian king, and the scripture says that he took everything. And my belief is that it was taken, brought back to Egypt, and it was probably just melted down or treated like any other item and used, and it's gone. Now, that's my belief. Some people believe that God would never have allowed it to fall into non-Israelite hands, and that he simply took it to heaven. And they claim Revelation 11:19, then God's temple in heaven was opened, and within the temple was seen the Ark of the Covenant. And there came flashes of lightning, rumblings, pearls of thunder, and an earthquake, and a great hailstorm. And so there are those that believe it exists in heaven. And of course, there are some that say, wait a minute, Nathan, the ark was so important. When the Israelites saw the Pharaoh approaching the city, they would have buried the Ark of the Covenant. They never would have let him have it. And so they believe that it stayed there until 586 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem. He leveled the city, laid waste to it, and so the ark is still buried underneath Jerusalem somewhere in a hidden chamber. And then there also are people think that Nebuchadnezzar took it himself when he leveled the city. So those are kind of some of the big theories as to where it ended up. I think the first one is most likely. I think it was just melted down and treated like any other decoration inside the temple. So the 10 Commandments have been lost to history physically. We still have the record of them, obviously. Now here's the 9th thing you may not know about the 10 Commandments. The first 4 commands are about God, and the last 6 commands are about each other. So command number 1 through 4 is about worship, about idols, about his name, and about the Sabbath. So this has to do with your relationship with God. The last 6 commands, parents, murder, adultery, steal, false testimony, and covetousness, that has to do with us getting along with each other. Now you might say, Nathan, why does that matter? Well, it reminds us that before we can get right with others, we must first be right with God. That getting right with God is the platform from which a marriage can be rebuilt. Getting right with God is the platform from which wounds of a family can be healed. Getting right with God is the platform from which you can get out of debt. Getting right with God is the platform from which you can be free from a stronghold. And so instead of trying to fix things, the best thing that we can do is get right with God, and then out of that position of strength, then to go and work for Him. And so these, I think, are ordered in importance, that worshiping Him and idols and His name and the Sabbath, these are of the utmost importance. So the first 4 are about Him, last 6 are about each other. Now here is the 10th thing. And you may say, wow, it's pretty early to have made it all the way through. We just have one more left. Well, this one's a little longer and possibly controversial. Here it is. Christians do not follow the Ten Commandments. Now, you might say, do you mean that we just don't obey them? It's not very clear. I should have worded it different. I mean that we are not supposed to follow the Ten Commandments. Now, you're thinking, wait a minute. If that's true, which I might not believe it, why are we here then? Let me explain. Why should Christians not follow the Ten Commandments? Now, this is just bear with me. I know what you're thinking. Okay, I mentioned that the Ten Commandments were part of a larger covenant, right? That it was part of a covenantal relationship. We are under a new covenant. Now, in Exodus 24, this is the passage of the creation of the first covenant. It says, he then took the covenant scroll and read it aloud to all the people. They responded, we will do and obey everything the Lord has commanded. Moses took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, this is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you concerning these words. This was a contract, a covenant that was sealed in blood. The Ten Commandments were a part of it. We don't follow the Ten Commandments because we are under a new covenant. Now, I know right now it's a big thing to refinance your home. And in fact, for many of you, you need to refinance your home, and you already did it, and you needed to do it. If you're facing a $2,000 a month mortgage and your income is going down or your income is flat, but inflation is occurring, that number is actually growing larger. And so you go there and you say, okay, I've got this contract. And you remember when you bought the house, it's actually like this big. There's a whole stack of paper. Yeah, it's just horrible, all the signing. So you've got this whole stack, and this is your contract. So you go to the bank and you say, I want a new contract. And they say, okay. And so you fill out all this paperwork, and then you have to let blood. They want your firstborn, all that other stuff. So you do all this stuff. You refinance your mortgage, and now you get your $2,000 a month payment down to $1,600. It's more reasonable. Well, you've got this new contract. It's very heavy. It's just as big as the old one. So you have the old one sitting there, and you have the new one. Now, the next month, you get a bill in the mail, and it says, you owe us $2,000. You're thinking, wait a minute. I thought it was $1,600. And they, say, sorry, our mistake. Because, you see, the new contract negates the old one. The old contract says you owe us $2,000 a month, and no matter what that says, the new contract negates the old one. And so you only owe $1,600 a month. We are under a new covenant, a new contract. Now let me give you some verses. This is from Jeremiah 31. This is long. Look, the days are coming. This is the Lord's declaration, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Now this is 700 years after the covenant with Moses. 700 years later. This one will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. A covenant they broke even though I had married them. The Lord's declaration. Instead, this covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, the Lord's declaration. I will place my law within them and write it on their hearts. I will be their God and they will be my people. So he says, okay, there's that old covenant. I'm going to make a new one, and instead of writing it on stone, I'm going to write the rules in your heart. And so there's this idea in the Old Testament that a new covenant, a new contract was coming. Well, that moves us to Luke 22. And we've read this at every Lord's Supper. Jesus said, this cup is the new covenant, established by my blood. It is shed for you. Paul goes on to say in 2 Corinthians 3, he says, you yourselves are our letter, written on our hearts, recognized and read by everyone, since it is plain that you are Christ's letter produced by us, not written with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on stone tablets, but on the tablets that are hearts of flesh. And so he talks about the law being written on the heart. A couple of verses later, he says, he has made us competent to be ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit, for the letter kills, but the Spirit produces life. Hebrews 8:13. By saying a new covenant, he has declared that the first is old, and what is old and aging is about to disappear. Some versions say obsolete. One chapter later, the writer of Hebrews says, therefore he, meaning Jesus, is the mediator of a new covenant. In other words, the prophet Jeremiah, Jesus, Paul, and the writer of Hebrews are all saying the same thing, that we are under a new covenant and the old one is obsolete. Now, this was a controversy in the early church. Here was the question. If a Greek person becomes a Christian, did they have to become a Jew first? Did a Greek man have to follow the law to be... Are we keeping both? Are we keeping the old covenant and the new covenant, where a Greek man has to be circumcised, has to follow the Old Testament law, but then follows Christ? Do we have to do both? And the end of it all was that no, we don't follow that law anymore. We're under a new covenant. And so we don't follow the Ten Commandments because we're under a new covenant. And I'll get to why we're studying them in just a second. But here's the second reason. We could not obey the old covenant if we wanted to anyway. If you sat out today, and by the way, there was a guy who did this online, and he wrote a book about it. He wasn't a Christian or a believer, but he just decided for a social experiment for 1 year, I'm going to obey all 613 laws of the Old Testament. And he grew a beard, and his wife was very angry with him, some of the stuff that he had to do, because when she was on her cycle, he wasn't allowed to be in the house, so he had to sleep outside during that time. He couldn't sit on a chair that she had sat on, and so he had to bring his own. It was really weird. But anyway, all this to say that it would not be possible to obey the laws. Why? Because they were given to a nation, not an individual. By the way, do you know that according to the Old Testament law, you would have to put your pastor to death for something that he did yesterday? According to the Old Testament law, you would have to take stones and bash my head in for something that I did yesterday. Everybody, let's get him. Well, what did I do that was so bad? Yesterday was the Sabbath, and I worked. And that was a capital crime. There was capital punishment for breaking the Sabbath, for adultery, also for cursing parents. Now, the funny thing is, you might think that's harsh, but imagine at, like, say, whatever school your kids go to, if one of them decided to curse their parents, then what they would do is they would gather the entire school together. They would take the rascal who did this, throw them in the center, and they would bash his or her head in with a bunch of rocks. That would only take one time. It would probably only happen about every generation. And all those kids would only need to see that one time, and there would not be a peep of cursing against parents. Anyway, these are things that were required in the Old Testament law. I don't know if you know, I've committed another crime. This shirt right here is actually against the Old Testament law. Does anybody know why? It's a blend. It's made of two different types of material. You weren't allowed to do that. And so I wouldn't be allowed to wear this shirt. And there are many of you men in this room that have also committed a crime. Some of you maybe not. Yeah, there's a couple of you who haven't. But it has to do with your beards. As a man, you are not allowed to trim the side of your beard. If you are clean-shaven here today, you've broken the Old Testament covenant. There were also very strict laws about ritual cleanliness, and so I don't want to get into all the details, but most of it has to do with women's cycles, and that during that time, the woman would have to leave the camp and go be off by herself, and anything that she touched and was unclean, then if I touched it, I was unclean, and it was this big mess. And so obviously there was reasons why they did this back then. But there were also sanctuary cities. There were Leviticals. So there was this entire system in place that you couldn't obey today because the system doesn't even exist. So we don't follow the Ten Commandments because we're not under that covenant, but we're also not even able to follow the covenant even if we wanted to. So you might say, okay, well, why do we study this? Why do we study the Old Testament then? 4 reasons. The first one is history. This was God's work. This is what God actually did. These aren't myths that have been handed down, but this is God's work in human history. It's also part of our heritage, that we are part of this story that has slowly been unfolding for thousands of years. We also study it for prophecy, that we can, the Bible speaks much to events that have not yet occurred. The final reason is the character of God. Even though we're not under that covenant anymore, we can still look at God and see His character and how He works, His grace, His wrath, and the mistakes that stupid people make, and we can avoid them. There's lots and lots to learn, but we're just not under that covenant. Now you might say, okay, what then do we do with the Ten Commandments? Why are you teaching us these things? Here's what I believe. That as Christians, we don't follow the Ten Commandments, but we do follow the fulfilled Ten Commandments. We don't follow the Ten Commandments as they are written, but we follow the spirit of the commandments. Let me give you an example. Commandment 6 says, do not murder. Now that's actually not that hard, because if I'm angry with somebody, I can key their car, I can set their house on fire, I can bludgeon them, I can break some ankles, I can cut the horse's head off and put it in the bed next to the... There are lots of I can find ways to get around this rule. Don't murder. Well, what would Jesus say to that? Hey, instead of don't murder, how about don't hate? Because if you don't hate, then you're not going to murder. So we would follow the spirit of that law, not the law. What about Commandment 4? Keep the Sabbath day holy. Instead of meeting on Saturday, the first Christians met on Sunday because that's the day on which the resurrection took place. And so the spirit of this is that we set aside a time for worship and for rest. And so the spirit is that we need to do that. But it's also not even a law, because there are times and places in your life where you aren't able to rest. Speaking of Veterans Day, do you think in boot camp that one of them can say, oh, I'm sorry, it's the Sabbath day, I'm not doing push-ups today? It doesn't work that way. And what about you mothers out there? Really? You get to take one day off a week? No, it doesn't work that way. And so the spirit of the command is that we find time to rest and to worship. What about commandment number 7? Don't commit adultery. Well, that's another easy one to get around. I've actually heard it among many young people, people that are Christians, teenagers, and growing up to become young adults, that it's important for them to keep their virginity, but they'll do everything else sexually outside of actual sex and then claim that, oh, I'm still a virgin, and they can take that with them. But they're doing everything else, and they're using this as kind of like a loophole. That's the problem with laws. But what would Jesus say? Instead of don't commit adultery, he would say don't lust. Because if you don't lust, then you can't commit adultery. So we follow the fulfilled Ten Commandments, the spirit of the Ten Commandments. And as we look at each commandment individually, we're going to look at not only what's written, but the spirit and the intent of what was there. I do have a challenge for you today. Inside your bulletin, there's that little communication card, and on that card on the back, I'm just challenging everyone to memorize these 10 commandments. There's only 10. And the first, you've already got it broken down. You know the first 4 are about God, and the last 6 are about each other. And so check that out. They're on the bottom of your notes. And just start working on those. And maybe by the end of this time, you'll get those memorized. If it's something you want to do, check that box just so I know who's responding. There was a curious story that came out of Modesto sometime in the spring of last year. You probably heard this story about a Modesto teacher who ran off with one of his students. Did you guys hear that story? I don't know all the details, and so there might be things about it that I don't know that you know. But from what I understand, this guy was a married man, and he actually had daughters who were in high school. He fell into infatuation with one of his students who was in his class. She was a 17-year-old senior. And they decided that they wanted to be together. So after she graduated and turned 18, he quit his job at the school, abandoned his family, and they moved in together. Our culture was and is at something of a loss as to what should happen in this situation. Because here's the problem. On a technical level, they didn't do anything wrong. She wasn't his student because she had graduated. She was 18, she was an adult, and he wasn't a teacher at the school because he quit. So there's something about us that says that's wrong, but technically they didn't do anything wrong, especially when our culture says that we ought to be tolerant of other people's sexual preferences. Our culture says we ought not to judge what is done between two consenting adults. Our culture says that we ought not to teach abstinence but safe sex and hand out implements of such. Our culture says that, in fact, we ought to have the government provide these accoutrements of safe sex. Our culture says, do what feels right, do what you think is right. And so, as far as we know, they didn't begin seeing each other until she was 18, and then she wasn't at the school, and he wasn't at the school, and everything that was done was legal and should have been acceptable according to our culture, but everyone squawked about it. And I'm thinking, why are you complaining when this is exactly what our culture is telling us is okay? Now, am I saying it was okay? No. Because I've got some truth. I have the moral authority. I have the objective standards of right and wrong to be able to make a comment on this. There's a God who sits on the throne, who created the heavens and the earth, and who created objective standards of right and wrong. And so I can look to the Ten Commandments and I can say, it says, don't commit adultery. That is wrong. I can look to Timothy, where Paul told Timothy, a young minister, he said, treat younger women as sisters with absolute purity. I can look to Jesus, who taught not even to lust after another person who is not your spouse. So I can look at the Old Testament, I can look at Yahweh, I can look at Paul, I can look at Jesus, and I can say that clearly this was wrong. I have the moral authority to say that. But our culture is a little confused. You teach this stuff, and then when it happens, you say, that's wrong. Why is it wrong? I'm not sure. It just feels that way. So that's where we are right now. We're in a culture that has a waning Judeo-Christian ethic. What is right, what is wrong, not only is it crumbling, it has been for some time. And so if there is anybody who should be able to proclaim an objective set of ethics, it has to be us. We are the last bastion, we are the last stronghold of ethics in this culture. And so we need to know this stuff. Next week, we start with the commandments, and we're going to go through them one by one. Let's stand together and let's pray.